welcome to the March podcast from the Monde diplomatique. My name's George Miller, and my guest this month is Renaud Lambert, who's the paper's deputy editor. Renaud has a piece in this month's paper entitled China, the Invention of the Roadmap to Global Power, in which he looks critically at the dominant Western narrative that maintains China is pursuing a master plan to remake the world in its own image, steered by a solitary autocrat, Xi Jinping. Before we get to the interview, just a quick reminder that all previous episodes of this podcast are on the website at mondediplo.com, and you can subscribe to it wherever you get your podcasts, so that you never miss another episode. Rather than a grand strategy for world domination, Renaud finds a messier reality of devolved power and economic self-interest being pursued by China's provinces. On this reading, China's widely discussed Belt and Road Initiative isn't part of an attempt to bring much of the developing world under its sway, but rather a post hoc way of giving coherence to a series of disparate initiatives. But even if its intent is less geostrategic than economic, what of its effects? And hasn't Xi in any case turned the tide back towards centralization of power and grand ambition? These are some of the questions I had for Renaud, but I began by asking him to set out for me the conventional narrative of what China's global aims are.
I guess diving into the mainstream media, most of the stories you will read about China, whether they be related to the Belt and Road Initiative or any form of foreign policy, the narrative is similar. You have an all-powerful head of the state, Xi Jinping, and somehow his conception of what China is supposed to do, his plan, trickles down through this humongous state and manages to directly organize the way, these billions of Chinese people will behave, or these thousands of companies will behave. Now, there's obviously a certain amount of verticality in communist states, but I think this way of portraying things is related to the way the West has traditionally tried to diminish the very possibility of there being some form of discussion, negotiation, and transactions within these enemy states. So this is the picture. We have a very immovable, top-down way of producing policy.
And I think you say in the article, the sort of theatrical presentation that you see at the center of the party in Beijing does kind of lend credibility to that interpretation, doesn't it? It kind of sets itself out as being about one man and then about a very select group of people in Beijing. So the presentation certainly lends a certain credence to that interpretation.
It definitely plays into the scenario, and perhaps we'll come to that later on in the interview, but there is definitely an attempt at re-centralizing the state, because the level of decentralization, which is oftentimes omitted or not seen by the media, has turned into a problem. So there you have a way of portraying the state as very centralized, and at the same time, a leader who is trying to re-centralize the state using every type of devices, whether they be bureaucratic negotiations or the rule of law, in order to fight corruption. The fight against corruption in China, as in Russia, for instance, is oftentimes a means of getting rid of adversaries within the state or within the party. So you have this double phenomenon, and certainly the theatrics is all aimed at giving Xi Jinping the power that the Western mainstream media seems to believe that he really has.
Yeah. So, as so often, it makes sense to look at the history and to try and see how, to test whether this thesis about how China operates and what its priorities are, whether that actually stands up to scrutiny when you look at the origins of the current setup. And in this case, you suggest that the best place to go back to is the period when Deng Xiaoping was in charge. So he comes to power in the late 1970s and remains in power throughout the 1980s. And it seems as though the 1980s was a critical decade for this shift in dynamic from centralization to decentralization. So can you talk about the circumstances in which Deng comes to power and what he seeks to do?
Yeah, Mao has died 2 years before, and there is a power struggle at the head of the Communist Party. And you have Mao's designated successor, who stands for a form of continuation of centralized, planified state control. And you have a opposing side embodied by Deng Xiaoping, who is trying to find any way he can to try and prevail. Now, the country is undergoing a pretty severe crisis at the time, and there are two analyses about why that is. It very often happens that an economic model runs out of steam, and sometimes you don't need to change your direction totally in order to improve on it. Deng Xiaoping, in order to try and prevail within the party, makes use of the crisis to try and say, we've gone wrong this way. We need to rely on local political forces and local economic forces in order to relaunch the economic accumulation process. As far as he is concerned, and this is the thesis, decentralization is both a means of relaunching the economy, reinvigorating the economy, and depriving the center of some of its power. Because if you say provinces and local companies are going to be responsible for capital accumulation, then you need to give them some leeway, some power, and that power comes from some place. It comes from the center. So there is a double process whereby decentralization is both an economic bet as well as a political tool in order to consolidate a social base, a political base for Deng Xiaoping and his rise to power. That phenomenon leads to a chain reaction from the economic perspective and the political perspective. Because once you've started opening up your economy, introducing market forces, then new contradictions are going to arise. And at every step, you need to go further into market reform. So they have a logic of themselves, and they tend to, once you've put a foot in the door, you're swallowed all the way. And then similarly, when you decentralize local powers, be they state representatives or rising economic elites, they agglomerate more and more power, and therefore their capacity to weigh on central decision becomes bigger and bigger. Now, this process goes quite far. Provinces are allowed to enter into contracts with foreign countries. They have their own foreign representation. They even enter into competition one against the other, which means that the planification process, which was eminently centralized under Mao, becomes a planification process at the level of provinces. And there is no or very little organization between provinces. And that leads to some very, very, very silly situations where there is redundant capacity.
Not only is there very little coordination, in fact, there's active competition, isn't there? It's almost like they're functioning as quasi-autonomous states. And the same thing is replicated within industries. You talk about the car industry in your piece. And so you have very anomalous situations where really quite small companies within a province are competing with other quite small, there's no sort of, none of the sort of harmonization and kind of national effort that we often in the West think of when we think about China. Everything is, planned at the center and carried out right down to the furthest reaches of the land. It's actually completely different from that.
Absolutely. Now, for this article, obviously, I rely on tons of research that have been done by academics. And I remember very well a figure that I don't think I quote in the article, where Chinese state research found out that most international Chinese companies see other Chinese companies are their main competitors, and a majority of them. So yes, there's a tremendous level of competition, and you see factory lines being created in different provinces, each province hoping that its factory line is going to be able to export within the country its own production. That leads to a tremendous amount of waste in a very capitalistic way. This is the process of creative destruction put in place within China, very far from, a very rigid command and control economy that sometimes, when you read the mainstream media, you see associated to China.
So, that raises the question, what is the centre for? What does the centre do? What power does the centre retain if in the 80s all this autonomy was given to provinces and to newly privatised industries? What nonetheless is the significance of the centre?
Well, I think there comes into play, the question of dialectics. A new form of power arises at the margin, in the provinces, at the local level. But the center still holds. It doesn't mean that the center doesn't have power. First of all, it still organizes exchange rates, interest rates. It still controls a great deal of, the way credit is circulated in the country. And the structures of the political party remain geared towards the center. But the negotiation within the party gives a little bit more weight to representatives from lower rungs of the pecking order. So you have this level of, I call it dialectics. The center does not disappear, but it needs to go into more negotiations. This is something that I think goes unseen. Even, when you look at the South China Sea, every incident in the South China Sea is seen as shedding light on the way the Chinese state envisions its presence in the South China Sea. Now, if you look at really what happens, often, most of the time, the incidents take place between, local fishermen, local province militias, whose only goal is not to embody China's foreign policy, but to look after their own economic interests. And what happens is sometimes the Ministry of Foreign Affairs needs to intervene afterwards in order to explain how the state, did not condone such action or to reprimand such or such actors. So, to answer your question, the center is still there, but it needs to negotiate with the margins.
So what would you say to someone who says, okay, that, I accept the analysis that in the 1980s there was a big move towards decentralization and there was privatization and it produced the situation that you've described. But with the advent of Xi, that's a real change in the tide, and now the direction is towards re-centralization, and things like the Belt and Road Initiative in fact do represent a sort of major sea change in Chinese policy and a drawing of power back towards the center.
I would say there is a definite element of truth in this. The decentralization and the incentive to make money, which perhaps I didn't underline enough, making money was a directive that led to an incredible amount of corruption. And a state cannot function with such a level of corruption if it's not controlled by the state itself, if there isn't a centralized enough mode of controlling this level of corruption. So Xi Jinping comes to power not out of thin air, but because there is a mandate to tackle this problem. And in order to tackle the problem, it needs to re-centralize. Now, is the Belt and Road Initiative a result of that policy? I doubt it. Because when you look at the way the Belt and Road Initiative is presented to the world in the beginning of the 2010s, there's very little directive. The project is quite blurry. I think that the Xi Jinping only gives a definition of what it's supposed to be around 2015. Now, a lot of the projects that are happening at the moment or that become part of the Belt and Road Initiative have begun before. They result from negotiations between provinces or state companies and foreign countries. So basically, it comes from the grassroots, it comes from the lower rungs, and it is put together, it is wrapped together as if the state was in a capacity to coordinate all of this. The state wants to be in the capacity to coordinate, and certainly it is making efforts in order to coordinate. But initially, this was not devised as a tool for geopolitical hegemony. It was only devised to put together initiatives by companies that needed to export their excess capacity, because that was a major problem for Chinese companies. So you see, you develop your production capacity. If you invest and don't redistribute some of the profit that are made so that it can turn into consumption, if you don't do that, then you end up with a lot of excess capacity, excess credit. And, in a capitalist regime, that needs to be used. Otherwise, it's capital cannot stay immobile. So Chinese companies see the opportunity of fixing their problem spatially. And that's where David Harvey comes, the famous Marxist geographer, comes very handy to explain what has happened, because he explains, and it's very traditional in capitalist society, capacity accumulates, and then you come to a problem where you have too much, you have excess capacity. And in order to carry on with the accumulation process, you need to find a spatial fix. And that, I think, and many people before me have thought, and I draw upon them, that I think is the root of the Belt and Road Initiative.
So what about the objection that even if the Belt and Road Initiative wasn't conceived with a geostrategic intent as its primary motivation, if it was primarily about economic self-interest, nonetheless, when China goes into the world and makes significant loans for major infrastructure, it has geostrategic impacts. It has an effect. What then about those? Because cumulatively, you could say, well, even if its origins were other, even if it was pragmatic, even if it was opportunistic, nonetheless, China is out there investing in the world in a very big way, creating relationships, potentially of dependence. Therefore, we should still be taking its geostrategic impact, even if not its intent, seriously.
Yes, I think that's a very good point. And I think in order to answer, one needs to go back to the discourse. What is being said by China? What is said is not China is investing in other countries, therefore this has a geopolitical effect. What people say, what experts, pundits from the mainstream media from the United States say is China is entrapping other countries. They talk about debt trap diplomacy. So basically it is a trap. China is not helping that. It's not building anything. It's only artificially trying to build for itself a hegemonic space. Now, I don't think that's what is happening. But this doesn't mean that the Belt and Road Initiative does not have a diplomatic effect, that does not have an impact on the way China is perceived. But if you look at what is really happening, and I draw my information from, The Economist, which is not, a Bolshevik publication, at this stage, even The Economist has to accept that the Belt and Road Initiative has shed a pretty good light on China. It is not true that this is moved by a debt trap diplomacy. Most of the time, whenever there is a problem with the loans, they are renegotiated to the disfavor of Chinese banks. And most of the projects are not decided by Beijing. They are decided by local governments in agreement with Chinese companies. So they're very much in favor of these projects. I was actually surprised to read, I think it was almost 2 weeks in a row, 2 very different articles in The Economist about the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, there was one article, it was can't remember who wrote it, but it was someone who was invited by The Economist to speak. And, he delivered the very mainstream attack on China, whereby Belt and Road Initiative was there to ensnare countries, and there was going to be rebellion against this, and China was basically an evil force. And then an article from The Economist, from researchers and journalists from The Economist, and they came to the conclusion that, well, no, it was going to have quite a durable effect and quite positive. So it is having a geopolitical effect. Now, was it conceived as a trap in order to change the international world order? Probably not.
So you come round in your piece to looking at the real roots of American anxiety, and I guess Western anxiety, but it's particularly focused in America because they are the economic hegemon at the moment. And you say that really the anxiety derives not so much from the fact that China is subverting the architecture of the international economic system. It's that it's making a very serious bid to change the hierarchy. In other words, the US is worried that it will actually lose its primacy as the world's most significant economy. And that is actually what lies behind all this rhetoric about China's ambitions to increase its geostrategic influence to the point where it is, the dominant power.
Correct. Again, going back to the mainstream line of analysis, you're basically presented with this situation whereby we'd have an ideal international world order, and it so happens that Washington is at the very top of this order, but it's just because it's the best order possible, We are lucky enough to live in the best possible world, and Washington is there at the very top. And then you have this country that we thought was going to play ball, and somehow it hasn't turned out the way we wanted, and now we're being told that it's subverting the international world order. Now, the reason for my article, the first part, what we've talked about, is basically to make the demonstration that, as a sociologist that I quote say, China is not so much an adversary to the international world order. It's a new player in a very old order. China has played ball. China has opened. China has played the free trade game. China has helped the United States pay for their double deficit. It has helped US multinationals to go global, to profit from a cheap workforce. So basically, I'm making the point that China, that the argument whereby, a new player was going to damage our beautiful international world order, that's not what is happening. The international, and basically the hypothesis is that to Washington, the international world order is not so much important because it works well, but because Washington is at the very top. And because within this game, China has become such a good player, such a powerful player, now it very much looks like the United States are willing to change the rules. And they are the ones changing the rules of the international world order. And I quote some, I think, pretty fascinating statements by a national security advisor to Joe Biden, who basically says the principle of organization of the world that prevailed up until now, whereby most importantly was free trade, and then, the rest trickled down from this. Now it's all come, upside down. The most important factor is national security. And the way we organize the economy will follow from national security imperatives. And that explains why we see more and more protectionist measures taken by the United States in order to prevent China from carrying on accumulating forces and certainly endangering Washington's position at the very top of the current international world order.
So you see that protectionist impetus within the economic sphere. And at the end of your piece, you quote really quite a shocking opinion by a US foreign policy commentator, which basically says, we have the means to subvert China's internal domestic stability, really as a sort of riposte to this hubris of becoming, or threatening to become hegemonic economically. If we can't compete, on a level playing field, if protectionism in itself isn't actually enough to stop China's rise, then perhaps we can think about destabilizing the country internally politically, which was, that's not official US policy, of course, but that it could be floated as an idea, that it could be put into the conversation, is already. We know that America has intervened in other states, but it's quite a big thing to be positing the idea of intervening within the domestic stability of a country like China, isn't it?
That analyst is not just any analyst. It's Graham Allison. He was responsible for devising Trump's policy on China, and he's been described as one of the foremost international relation experts by Joe Biden. And the book I drew the quote from is a book called Thucydides' Trap, where Graham Allison tried to explain and see whether it is possible for Washington and Beijing to escape what happened between Athens and Troy. Is it inevitable that when a new power rises, it leads to war with the former power? And under the guise of saying, well, if they get together and they talk and we organize things, we can avoid war. He does put forward a strategy that sometimes feels like it's been seen in other places. And basically what he says is that, we can try and widen fractures within the Chinese states and basically push where it hurts. And where is that? Well, it's in Hong Kong. It's in Xinjiang. It's in Taiwan. Now, if you look at Taiwan, which was hardly a problematic place, in the US-China relationship, and see how it has become a place of increased heat, and we talk about the possibility of war, and you put that in the context of the quote by Graham Allison, you do wonder whether a US strategy might not be unfolding already. And again, that leads back to the mainstream discourse on China. As I quote at the start of the article, the official line is that China has a strategy. They are following a plan. I mean, there is an expert who says that plan has been devised from 1949, and they're following it step by step, obviously, because Chinese people don't think, they don't change, they follow the rules. They're very obedient, so they have a plan for about a century, and this is about to land, and it's a plan for world domination. And the idea is to show that, the very existence of this strategy means that, they have an ulterior motive. Anything they do is for another reason. Now, whether that strategy exists or not, and I try and suggest that some of the evidence that I put forward to suggest that it does exist, might be, might need to be questioned. I think there is a US strategy, or at least there are some elements out there that tend to point to a US strategy.
I was speaking to Renaud Lambert, whose article in this month's paper is entitled China, the Invention of the Roadmap to Global Power. You can read it at mondediplo.com. This month's edition also features coverage of the Houthis' defiance of Washington, the ongoing turmoil in Sudan, and Ukraine's minority Hungarian community. And an article on climate change asks what it means that some politicians are now talking about adapting to a 4-degree centigrade rise at average temperatures. If you're a subscriber, You can read the latest edition as well as every other edition of the paper going back over 25 years and online exclusive content. And if you're not yet a subscriber, there's plenty of open access content online to entice you to become one, including a full archive of this podcast. You'll find all previous episodes on Le Monde Diplomatique's website, and you can subscribe on your favourite podcast app to make sure you don't miss future ones. In the words of John Berger, why read LMD? To make sense of what's happening in the world behind the misinformation. I'll be back again next month with another interview with one of our contributors. Until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.